So the first one we're going to talk about is this article, condemned and condoned, and then we're going to slide into talking about intimate partner relationships as a sort of like sub-area of marriage and the family. Which also get us into kind of like the sociology of sex a little. Okay, so we kind of started our discussion in sort of broad strokes, right? So we were looking at marriage and family and how it changed in sort of like massive sort of geographic and historical trends, right? And in particular focusing on how different ways of organizing families are across different societies, as well as how different forms of mate selection, right, forms of marriage are. And so a lot of that revolves around information about places that was gathered 50 or 60 years ago, 100 years ago, right, when societies were quite different, or their historical records, right? But most of the world's been westernized, right, in some degree. So most of the world has not escaped globalization. And so we see often very changing patterns in different places. So in particular, this article is looking at where? Where does this article take place, this condemned and condoned article? And that the author is Agdianian, I think is how you would say that. I think you pronounce the J like a Y.
Africa?
Yeah, so we're in Africa. Africa's a big place, It's the size of North America and Europe combined.
Well, it says sub-Saharan.
What's it? Yeah, so does anybody know where that is? Sub-Saharan? So if you're thinking about a map of Africa, right, the Sahara's up here. This is sub-Saharan Africa, all that. So it takes place, so it's discussing sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is usually culturally very different from the Saharan Africa. So Saharan Africa is more like the Middle East. Sub-Saharan Africa is more distinct regionally. So it's interested in, and this is, Sub-Saharan Africa was a place where it was very common to practice what kind of marriage that we were talking about last week. Yeah, it's very common to practice polygamy in sub-Saharan Africa, or at least, especially before colonization, it was super common. So, did they catch? So, what happened when to marriages when people colonized sub-Saharan Africa? What do you think happened? What happened to people's religious beliefs when sub-Saharan Africa was colonized? What do you think? What happened to most places' religious beliefs when they were colonized? More what?
More diverse, like they broke out into different denominations.
In terms of their religious beliefs, you mean? I'm confused by the answer. Sorry, I don't know what you're driving at.
Like not everyone had the same beliefs because people brought other beliefs with them, and so like people started to agree with different things.
Oh, so you're saying that like in that individual geographic location, there's more religious diversity. What else happened, do you think? What are most people in? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I guess it was just that switch from like a lot of like tribal beliefs or like older ancient practices, and then switching over to traditional Christian ideas, and so it's like kind of revolutionized switch over to Christian beliefs.
Yeah. Most of Africa becomes Christianized. Most of sub-Saharan Africa, we should say, becomes Christianized. What was being practiced before there is going to depend on where in sub-Saharan Africa you're talking about. Up in like areas like West Africa, most people were Muslims, but different religious beliefs pervaded. In a lot of ways, like, and so this is why I think I got a little confused. So, like, if you think about the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, religious diversity decreases a lot, right? Because essentially you get either some sort of syncretism with Christianity or just the dying out of a lot of indigenous beliefs. There's very few people in sub-Saharan Africa that practice indigenous beliefs without practicing on top of that some form of Islam or Christianity. So by and large, right, we're talking about particularly, like, does anybody recognize what country this article in particular takes place in? Mozambique, which is fairly south into Africa. So we're talking about, when we're talking about religious beliefs here, we're talking about a country that is predominantly Christian. So we're not talking about a country that is removed from, I guess, like, discourses about Christianity. So most people would self-identify as Christian of one type or another. How does that affect their marriages? That's kind of the question of the article, right? What's the effect on polygamous marriages within Christianity in a place where it was predominantly practiced before? Right? Did anybody catch anything about that? And here we're going to get into something that's pretty common in sociology about practices versus beliefs. Do people practice polygamous marriages in Mozambique still? Yeah. So the thing is, basically the article is looking at how is it that we navigate, right, this fact that, like, you have a nation that's pretty much been entirely Christianized, yet this practice that, at least on the surface, Christian churches say you shouldn't do, still persists and is actually quite common. So, quite commonly, people who belong to Christian churches in Mozambique have multiple wives. People have wives after they belong to that church, right? So a lot of times you're talking about people, this isn't like all of a sudden sort of mass conversion. We have a tendency to think about Africa as if, like, no one there is Christian, but by and large, like, you're talking about people who, just like here in North America, just like a good chunk of the world, people who would have been raised from early on within the church. So you're talking, so the question is, how do you how are they negotiating that, right? What do you see happening? So basically the study is a statistical study on different people's religious beliefs and where within Christianity you see different patterns, either in the beliefs about polygamy or the actual practice itself. So, last time for statistic charts. It's the last one I'm going to show you. So if we get up, okay, so I'm going to make you guys tell me, we've looked at quite a few of these. Tell me, one, what are the variables we're using? Where should you look first to figure that out? What's going to tell you what the chart's about? Where's the first place you should always look? Somebody has a meeting or something. What's the first place you should look on a statistical chart?
Like the title.
Yeah, the title of it. What's our title?
Denominational variations in the likelihood of polygamous union and the perception of acceptability of polygamous marriages in the church.
Okay, so what does that, what's being said there? You gotta love that, like, no matter how plainly written the article is, the second they throw up a statistical chart, it starts, like, sounding all jargony. So what's being said here? So what's the question? What are the variables? What's the variables at the top, basically? What are they?
like how likely they are to be in that polygamous marriage, or like how acceptable it is?
Yeah, perceptions and actions, right? Usually, and we're going to look at this in a little bit more depth when we talk about the other one, differences in perceptions and actions are very important when we talk about sexual behavior amongst human beings in sociology, because often what we think and what we do are not the same thing. So the thing that we profess is right is often the thing that we don't necessarily do. So it's looking at, on the one hand, the likelihood of being in it versus the perception of whether people should basically have polygamous marriages, and then they're comparing that across different denominations. Okay. So what do we look for when we look at the numbers? The stars. Yep, the stars and the what? This is like the one thing you guys are gonna. I mean, I've drilled into over and over again. So, stars and what? Whether it's positive or negative. So where do we see stars, positives, and negatives? We have the little crosses here as well, which is just smaller than stars, but stars. Yeah.
I think all of my stars are negative. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, so all the correlations are negative correlations. No, there's some positive ones.
Oh.
There's a couple. So what do we notice? Let's start with their big question, denomination. That's what they're really interested in. And we'll kind of get into as we look at these one. So what denominations have a star?
What do the crosses mean?
The crosses are like stars.
Oh.
There's just so mathematically, so it's like their level of confidence. The always accepted one is going to be 0.1, 0.5, 0.10. And then they have like basically so it's 0.01, 0.05, 0.10, right? And then essentially like if they accept a even higher level of probability, then they put a cross. So that's what the cross is. Or even lower, I guess even lower amount of probability that it's due, to a correlation. So where do we see them? And which ones? Which numbers? What things correlate?
The apostolic and then the Roman Catholic.
Yeah, so you have, so the Roman Catholic, in terms of likelihood of being in a polygamous union, what's the relationship? It's a negative relationship and it's statistically significant. What does that mean? Roman Catholics are what in Mozambique? They're less likely to be in a polygamous relationship. Okay, so then we also have over here for Roman Catholics, negative and stars, even stronger correlation. Quite the strong correlation. What's that saying? Roman Catholics are what?
Perception is
Yeah.
negative.
So generally speaking, Roman Catholics will have a negative perception of polygamy in Mozambique. That's okay. So then you have here mainline Protestant, if you notice, does not have a relationship with being polygamous. So basically, whether or not you're Protestant, like mainline Protestant Christian in Mozambique has nothing to do with whether or not you are in a polygamous relationship, whether or not you have multiple wives. Okay, but the perception is equally correlated. So basically, like amongst mainline Protestants, you're just as likely to think that it's wrong to have a polygamous marriage, but you are more likely to have a polygamous marriage than if you're Roman Catholic. There's one last thing here, this neo-Pentecostal. So that's representing churches that are specifically African. So there's a lot of like charismatic churches that splintered off from Pentecostalism, and this is true throughout sub-Saharan Africa, that are specifically African. So there's not church bodies that you would see anywhere else in the world, but they're kind of their own indigenous reading of Christianity. And here you see, and they're also so part of the context here as well is that they're in some ways kind of a faster growing variant of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa. So what you're seeing here is that there isn't a correlation, right? Just like for mainline Protestants, but there is. So the idea of the article is basically like, so understanding what the relationship between these statistical relationships. Basically, what our author's trying to claim is that first of all, which is the older religion in Mozambique? Do you think? If you were just to guess. Catholicism, yeah. Mozambique was colonized by the French, and in a lot of ways, Roman Catholicism is probably the oldest religion in Mozambique now, right? So these other forms of Protestantism and the Neo-Pentecostalism and the Apostolic tradition, these are all things that come later, right, into Mozambique. So you've seen throughout the sort of like rise of Roman Catholicism and into the rise of these sort of new religions, that the polygamy in Mozambique has still persisted, right? So our article is basically saying what we see now often is really kind of competition in terms of how tolerant a church body is to people being polygamous actually has a big deal, a fair amount of pull on whether they're growing in the region. So churches end up sort of like, in a weird way, competing to be okay, or at least like look the other way at, right? Because that's often what you're getting here, right? They look the other way. They say that they don't accept it and that you shouldn't have a polygamous union, but then if one of their congregates has a polygamous union, they don't really step in the way, right? And that's actually like one of the driving forces for the changing face of religion in Mozambique, is kind of the point. So once again, like, this isn't meant as an ethical statement, right? Sociology is rarely gonna, and you'll find that, I'm sure you kind of found that throughout the articles, sociology rarely makes kind of like ethical statements about what's going on. It's more descriptive than that, right? So it's just interested in how is it that this persists, and mainly it's because of competition between denominations allows polygamy to continue as a cultural practice, despite the fact that the church pretty much, religiosity rates are much higher in Africa than in the United States. So you're talking about people who are actually quite religious, but then they'll end up practicing this form of marriage. And so basically what the author is saying is that's largely because of this weird marketplace that's constructed that has allowed it to persist over time. Any questions or thoughts about that? So here we see, right, once again, the same sort of variation that we were talking about before. Those variations persist across the world, but in a much different context than they used to. Okay, let's move on to the next article. Okay, our next article is the sexual and romantic relationships of young adults. And that's by Tillman, Brewster, and Holloway. So in understanding like sexual and romantic relationships within context, I think that to a sociologist, we often ask the wrong question. So I think a lot of times what people want to ask when it comes to questions, particularly questions about how promiscuous people are being, they want to ask, are things worse than they used to be? Like, are people more promiscuous or less promiscuous, right? And that's a weird question for a few reasons. One, it's difficult, if not impossible, to actually answer. Why is that? Why do you think that might be? What's going to be the difficulty in figuring out how promiscuous people's sexual practices are?
People are really like private about it and don't really talk about it.
Yeah, people are often very private about it. If we were to make a comparison to the past, are people more or less private about their sexuality? What do you think? In the past, did people talk about sex more as much as today? No, people were more private about it. So it's often very difficult to make a sort of like long comparative statement about that. There's other things too. So there's, you know, the quietness. What we consider aberrant often changes. So things that people would have been more comfortable with in the past, they're less comfortable with now. A good example of this is like engaging in sexual practices with underage people in the early 20th century. It was far more acceptable than it is today, right? So by comparison, like, you know, people are far more comfortable with homosexuality today than they were back in the early 20th century. So there's things like that as well. And so really, like, in a lot of ways, a better question might be, what practices do people practice in what times, and what drives the change? And that's more of how sociology would want to talk about it. So rather than viewing it in a scale of a higher or lower, or yes or no, it's more on a scale of what's commonly practiced. One of the biggest studies ever done on human sexuality and romantic relationships was, has anyone ever heard of the Kingsley Report? So this guy named Alfred Kingsley interviewed, so he didn't send out surveys, he interviewed 18,000 people between the year 1948 and 1956. So like, that's he does two different studies, right? It's a massive study. And he finds all kinds of things that you just wouldn't really expect. But basically it could be summed up that under sort of like the polite veneer of like a time that we would assume people were far less promiscuous, you find all kinds of things that people are engaging in. So people often have a fair number of sexual partners. And people are very likely to practice extramarital affairs, right? Far more common in the 50s than it is today. And so like you see all through these changes. Another way in which people in that era were more promiscuous is people were far more likely to have bought a prostitute. People don't buy prostitutes anymore for the most part. It's actually fairly rare. And this is even harder to know, but there's questions about like whether sexual assault was more common. It was definitely socially more acceptable, right? But whether or not that translated into behavior is another question. Going back to that idea that our attitudes and our behaviors are very different. So what you often find is in the past people had harsher attitudes about sex, but they didn't necessarily have, I guess, like less promiscuous sexual behaviors. I wrote down a bunch of statistics that sort of like allowed me to sort of jump through that. But another one that's just worth sharing. So I mentioned that extramarital affairs were higher in the early 20th century. If we're talking about people alive today, you know who are, anybody want to guess what age range is most likely to engage in an affair? People over the age of 55. significantly more likely to engage in an extramarital affair than anyone younger. Actually, millennials, so people under the age of 32, are the least likely out of any generation to engage in an extramarital affair. Even holding for the fact, so just amongst married millennials, it's very unlikely. So there's so getting back to the point is there's a lot of different ways we could think about, right, changes in sexual relationships. So that kind of gets us into our article. So our article is, what are some of the findings on how sex is changing here? So how is intimate relationships changing in the latter half of the 20th century and in the early 2000s, or mid-2000s, or, well, till today. Article was published in 2019. What are some changes that we see? What's probably the biggest change in people getting married?
People are getting married less. It's less of an ideal end goal.
Yeah. It's less significant. Does anybody want to rephrase that a little? That's totally true, but like, anybody want to rephrase it a little?
Maybe like people are getting older before they get married because they're always going to school.
I think that's a slightly different idea, but we'll write it down. That the age is increasing for marriage.
This also might be kind of different, but like I guess there used to be like kind of like an order, like you would date, you would get married, you'd have kids and so on.
Yeah.
And now it's like a lot of it can be kind of wishy-washy. You can switch and you can like move in before you get married or have a kid and all these different other things.
Yeah, and I think you guys are kind of picking up on the same thing, yeah. So there was more of an order to when and how you got married. So, like, it was a stage of life, right? So like if you think about like, we have things that are set sort of like ritual stages of life that we go through. It talks a lot about from a life course perspective, right? Meaning like as we chart, life course is like a way of doing sociology where you chart how people's lives change throughout their lifetime. And so from a life course perspective, we look at how people's lives change over their lifetime. What we find is that marriage is less important as a form of ordering, right? So like, it was very clear if we went into the early 20th century, when did you get married? When did people in the early 20th century get married?
Early 20s?
Yeah, your late teens or early 20s. Your late teens or your early 20s. So it's very much so like, and if you think about like, when we have some sort of like idealized past of what marriage looks like, usually what we're thinking about is sort of like this, like people were high school sweethearts, they graduated, they got married, yada, 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 right? Which was a reality of people, even a lot of Americans into the 1970s, right? But after that, you get very different changes. What's the average age that people get married now?
25 to 30.
25 to 30. Just as a, did anybody catch when people usually became sexually active on average in the United States? And this is the same for both eras. '17. So most people first engage in, well, intercourse, right? Often the average age for other forms of sexual activity are lower for the first time, but on average, people's first experience with intercourse happens at the age of 17. And that's true in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, right? So like, that's been a pretty persistent number. So what does that mean? What's changed? What's the change here? If we wanted to, if we take those three numbers together. The gap has widened, right? So the gap between initial sexual activity your introduction to sexual activity and the age at which you marry, right, change. Now most people, this is one of the findings, most people expect to get married still. So like it's not that people have forsaken getting married for the most part in the United States. We sometimes talk that way in news media. Still, especially in the United States in comparison to Europe, the vast majority of people plan on getting married, right? They just plan on doing it much later, right? So it's put off, which just increases this gap between initial sexual activity and the age at which they marry. So basically the idea is, from this sort of life course perspective, is that marriage is still an important part of our society today, but it's less prescriptive in how this occurs, as well as when. So if we were to go back thinking about, once again, if you were to like read the Kingsley report, right, you'll find this is true in his study as well. Most studies of essentially past sexual activities show that most people have premarital sex, even into the past. So, which I mean, you almost have to if your average age is 17, right? So most people had premarital sex, but they didn't have as many premarital sex partners, largely because the gap is not so large. Okay, what other changes do we see? There's a lot of changes in this article. What other changes in sexual, intimate partner relationships do we see? What's something that people are far more common to do than they did in the past as partners before they get married?
Have children.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, that is true. A lot of people, more people have children before. All right. What else do we have? Yeah, cohabitation. Cohabitation is a lot more common. And I think culturally we see a very different attitude towards cohabitation than we used to have in the past, right? Like, so people often cohabitate. They'll live together for a while before they're married. And this is true. So like, and one of the things too, like, we often want to feel like this is true only, this sort of stuff would be true only for certain groups of people, but largely this holds constant across most demographics. So regardless of your race, class, as well as things like religious affiliation, more often than not people are marrying later and they all engage in more cohabitation and have more premarital sex than they used to. So regardless of demographics, that's generally going to be true. I feel like I should erase the Africa. It feels dissonant to me. I don't know why. Maybe I'm being a little OCD. There we go. Okay. Did anybody catch, our author offers one very important causal explanation for this change. It's sociology. We like talking about institutions and how they influence things. So what's the other institution that's affecting marriage and family practices? Did anyone catch this? I'll give you a clue. It's on page 136. That's where this discussion starts.
Contraception?
What's that?
Is it contraception?
No, that's not what it's driving at. And actually, like a lot of these things, so even in this period, contraception is happens a lot earlier than we see this shift.
Yeah. Because I guess I was just like saying, maybe because it's like just contributed to this shift, because it just like allows people to push it off.
Yeah, yeah. Well, gosh, the way I set it up though, we're talking about all era, because I mean, you get contraception being practiced pretty widely in the United States in the 19th century. So like, I mean, it's not as effective, right? So like, in terms of effective birth control, we see it getting more effective than it used to be. So now we probably have the most effective forms of contraception. Particularly, you think about things like IEDs or you know, stuff like that. But even into the like mid 1800s, people used condoms. They were just made out of lamb skin. You can still buy them if you're allergic to latex. So anyway, so that's not what the author. I mean, I think that may be a causal factor. It's not the one that the author is looking at. So what major institutional changes? Because we're talking mostly about a shift that's happened since the 1980s. So relatively new. Like my parents got married at 19. I think that's like, you guys are probably getting a little young to have parents that, how about, anybody, like, how many people in here's parents married 30 to 25? A few, some of you guys. How many people married like 20 to 25? How many people married as teenagers? Now, if even going back, like I'm, what, like 12 years, 13 years older than you guys. If you were to go back just in that amount of time, probably a third of this room, their parents married before they were 20. You know? So I was thinking about, that's the demographic shift that's kind of being discussed. That's actually when we get higher cohabitation rates. That's when we get larger numbers of. So all these shifts happen as we see people marrying later and later. So why do people marry late? I could ask you guys, why are you guys not married right now? That's a good one. Yeah, there's a good place to you're broke. I like that. Yeah, we'll keep on going with that. We'll come back to being broke. What else?
Focused on like other things like school.
Yeah, you guys have to go to school. Why do you go to school? Why do you? So if we were to go back to your parents' generations, a lot less people went to school in their parents' generation than go now. Why? Why is that?
There's less of an opportunity.
Yeah, if you don't go to school, right, the wage gap in terms of going to school versus not going to school, despite what people like to say colloquially in conversation, has been growing.
Well, my parents like, well, they graduated college, but my dad went to law school after,
Yeah.
and my mom put him through law school.
Yeah.
Like, it was cheaper, so they could still go to school while they were married. And
Yeah.
so there was just that opportunity to just continue your education while you were married. That would be possible.
My wife and I did that too. Actually, I'd say, maybe this is bad, like, maybe I shouldn't phrase this as advice, but if people want to go to grad school and they have a partner they would like to marry, totally is a good idea. Everyone who was married, like, in grad school had so much more disposable income than everybody who wasn't. Because you had one partner who could work full time, right? And then your meager stipend you didn't just have to live off of. Yeah, my wife put me through graduate school. Now she gets to do theater stuff without bringing in much income because, like, now I bring in income, so we traded. Anyways. Okay, so yeah, people put it off because of school. And it's mainly because the ability to get good enough jobs to live off of comfortably without a college degree has decreased, right? And when you think about when we were talking about deindustrialization, right, that's the same process. It used to be that, like, you know, I think about my father-in-law made $90,000 a year as a millwright with nothing but a high school education in the 80s, right? Those kind of jobs just don't exist anymore, right? It's hard to do that. So you have to essentially you have to be schooled to make a decent middle class wage usually. So there's that. So what's it gonna look like after? So like we're talking like, when do you graduate? You're like what, like 22, 21 on average, right? Something like that. 22, I think it's 22. So why all the way here? What does it look like after college? Not to be depressing, but what does life look like after college for people in your and my age range? So we're talking about big 20-year swath of people.
You have to like build a career.
Yeah. Okay, so people are retiring later and later, which means it's going to take you longer to build a career. Your chances for advancement are significantly smaller than they were 30 years ago. So even though you'll on average make more money than somebody who doesn't go to school, it's going to take you quite a while to actually build up. You're looking at often the distinction that's being made is something somewhere around what your parents made in their 30s, you will probably have to take until your 50s. Right? So, go ahead.
I was gonna say, a lot of people owe money after school.
Yeah, you have debt. A lot of debt. You will have a lot more debt than your parents did. It's good debt, right? College debt, you don't get thrown in jail for it. You can adjust it on the basis of your income, right? I've said this before in class, when you graduate, make sure you get income contingent repayment programs. It's the best thing for you to do. But you're going to be paying for at least 20 years a good chunk of your income towards your debt. And then usually people don't ever pay it off, and after 20 years the loan just gets forgiven, and that's actually what occurs. So you're talking about having a lot more debt. Right? What about wages? Does anybody know what's happening with wages the last 16 years? We have wage stagnation. So what our author wants to claim is that, and lastly, how many people, if we were to compare it to the past, how many families have one breadwinner? This is a major changing demographic. How many people in a couple works?
It's more common for both of them to work than for just one of them to work.
Yeah. Even if you didn't want to do that, how feasible is it to live off of one income for most people? The cost of living is high enough in the United States that you can no longer live off of one income usually. Most people don't earn enough. So we're talking about dual income families as well. Why would this affect the age at which you get married? What do you think? Being a dual income family. Yeah.
Maybe you can wait till you or the person you've been married to can get to that point in your career where you're making enough money so you can settle down and actually have money to raise promotions and stuff.
Oh yeah, so you might have people, and I've known people who do this, where eventually they go down to one breadwinner, but they wait a lot longer to have children so they can do it. My brother-in-law did that. Brother and sister-in-law did that. And so now she's a stay-at-home mom, but he had to essentially move up far enough in the ranks that he could make enough money. So you do get that too, yeah. You also get women get to wait until their careers are established enough that they can actually take the time off, right? They can take maternity leave, and it's okay. So all that pushes things further down, right? So the idea is that we often want to talk about these things more as people making choices. People are choosing to get married later, people are. But then there's a question of, even if you wanted to get married really young and do that, there's a lot of structural impositions that sort of would keep you from doing that. And if you actually interview people at why they get married when they do, why they have children when they do, it's largely because of things, sort of economic reasons. So this is how people discursively even talk about why they get married when they do often. So point is that a lot of the sexual behaviors that we're associating, right? Cohabitation, children before marriage, number of sexual partners outside of marriage. If we look at statistics like that and we're thinking about them, it's largely because of this increasing gap, right? In other words, like people are beings, and they have desires, and when they act upon those in our current system, it creates those things that we see of as basically being more promiscuous. So there's structural impulses to it, right? In the same way, if we wanted to go into the past and be like, and ask like, why is it in the 20th century it was more common for people to have extramarital affairs? There's a structural impetus for that, right? It's because people get married really young. It's because you're usually limited in who you can marry to by geographic location, by social where you basically your smaller social networks within your community, right, et cetera, et cetera. Even your choice of like who you're going to marry, if we get far enough back into the 20th century, isn't as open, right? So like a lot of those things create marriages that are difficult to sustain, which is why people who got married earlier in the 20th century have a tendency. And then you also get things like some pretty harsh gender norms, right? Larger power imbalances within male-female relationships, which creates a lot higher marital dissatisfaction. And that related to people having more extramarital affairs, right? Marital satisfaction amongst younger people, right, or newer generations is actually higher, right? So why is it that extramarital affairs occur less often? Well, there's major structural reasons why those occur, right? So essentially, like if you're thinking sociologically, going back to it, the question isn't, are things getting better or worse in terms of, or are people being more or less promiscuous? The question is how do we see these changes in sexual activity actually being driven by historical change, right? Okay, any last questions before we close up shop for the day? Great. So we have one more article next Monday. That is, we're going to talk a little bit about gerontology. Gerontology is the study of elderly people. We're going to read an article on multi-generational households. So between then and now, we'll do another set of presentations. Do people know who's presenting on Wednesday? Do people know if they're presenting on Wednesday? Make sure you look.